January 15th, 1919, 12:30 p.m., Boston's North End. The temperature has been unseasonably warm for mid-January, 46 degrees Fahrenheit after days below freezing. On Commercial Street, near the waterfront, workers are eating lunch. Children are collecting firewood near the docks. A city streetcar rumbles past, heading toward the elevated railway. At 529 Commercial Street sits a massive steel tank, 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter. It holds 2.3 million gallons of crude molasses, thick, dark, sticky liquid that smells sickly sweet even from a distance. The tank belongs to the Purity Distilling Company, which uses molasses to produce industrial alcohol. The tank has been there since 1915. 4 years of Boston winters and summers, 4 years of the steel expanding and contracting with temperature changes, 4 years of stress on poorly tested welds and rivets installed by workers who were never given proper blueprints. Local residents have complained about the tank since it was built. It leaks constantly, dripping molasses down its sides. Children collect the drippings in cans. The company's response has been to paint the tank brown so the leaks are less visible. At 12:40 p.m., Isaac Gonzalez is driving a wagon past the tank when he hears a sound like machine gun fire. Rivets are popping, one by one. Pop, 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 faster and faster. Then the entire tank explodes. Not with fire, not with blast force, but with 2.3 million gallons of molasses bursting through ruptured steel at a temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough that the molasses flows like water instead of sitting thick and slow. The initial wave is 25 feet high, moving at 35 miles per hour. It weighs approximately 13,000 tons. It hits Commercial Street with the force of a tsunami made of syrup. Buildings are crushed. A firehouse collapses, killing firefighters inside. The elevated railway support columns buckle. People running from the wave are caught and pulled under, drowning in thick brown liquid that fills their lungs faster than they can scream. Isaac Gonzalez and his horse are swept away instantly. The horse drowns within seconds. Gonzalez will survive but spend days in the hospital coughing up molasses. In the next 4 hours, the wave of molasses will kill 21 people, injure 150 more, and cause millions of dollars in damage. It will create a disaster so bizarre that people will think it's a joke until they see the bodies. And when investigators finally examine the wreckage, they'll discover that this disaster was entirely preventable. The tank was doomed from the day it was built. The company knew it, the engineers suspected it, and nobody did anything to stop it. This is the story of the Great Molasses Flood, the disaster that sounds ridiculous until you understand the physics of why molasses at 35 miles per hour is as deadly as a tidal wave. To understand why the flood happened, you need to understand how badly the tank was designed. The Purity Distilling Company built the tank in 1915 to store molasses shipped from the Caribbean. The molasses would be processed into industrial alcohol used for manufacturing explosives during World War I. The demand was enormous. The company needed maximum storage capacity as quickly as possible. Arthur Gell, the treasurer of Purity Distilling, hired the Hammond Iron Works to construct the tank. The specifications were ambitious: 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter, capable of holding 2.3 million gallons. But there was a problem. The tank was never properly designed by a qualified engineer. No stress calculations, no proper blueprints. The construction workers built it based on rough sketches and guesswork. The steel plates were 0.5 inches thick at the bottom, barely adequate, and only 0.25 inches thick at the top. The rivets holding the plates together were installed hastily. Many were poorly aligned. The welds were inconsistent. Worse, the company never tested the tank properly. Standard practice for a container this size would be to fill it with water and monitor it for leaks and structural integrity before putting it into service. Purity Distilling filled it directly with molasses because water testing would have taken time and cost money. The first time molasses was pumped into the tank in December 1915, it leaked immediately. Molasses seeped through the seams. Local residents complained about the smell and the sticky mess coating the streets. The company's solution was cosmetic: paint the tank brown so the leaks wouldn't be as visible. They also spread sawdust around the base to absorb the dripping molasses. Problem solved as far as they were concerned. Over the next 4 years, the tank continued to leak. Employees reported hearing the metal groan and creak when the tank was full. One worker later testified that he could hear rivets popping loose even before the disaster. In 1916, an engineer named Isaac Moulton inspected the tank and reported concerns about its integrity. The company ignored his warnings. By January 1919, the tank had been through 4 winters of freeze-thaw cycles. The steel had expanded and contracted hundreds of times. Microscopic cracks had formed in the welds. Rivets had loosened. The entire structure was weakening. And then, on January 12, 1919, the company pumped in a fresh shipment of molasses, nearly 600,000 gallons, bringing the tank close to full capacity. The temperature had been below freezing for weeks, which meant the molasses inside was thick, almost solid, exerting relatively little pressure on the walls. But on January 15th, the temperature rose suddenly to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Warm molasses expands. It becomes less viscous, more fluid, and it exerts significantly more pressure on the tank walls. The tank was already structurally compromised. The sudden temperature increase was the final stress it couldn't handle. At 12:40 p.m., the steel gave way. When the tank ruptured, it didn't just leak or crack. It exploded. The bottom of the tank failed first. The steel plates tore away from their rivets with a sound witnesses described as a roar. The force of 2.3 million gallons of molasses bursting free ripped the tank apart, sending steel panels flying through the air like shrapnel. One piece of steel, weighing several tons, was thrown 80 feet and embedded itself in the wall of a building. Another panel sliced through the elevated railway support girder like paper. But the real killer was the molasses itself. The initial wave was 25 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour. That's as fast as a car driving through a residential neighborhood. But unlike water, molasses is viscous, thick, and sticky. It has the density of concrete. Getting hit by a wall of molasses at 35 miles per hour is like being hit by a moving truck. People didn't have time to react. One moment, Commercial Street was a normal January afternoon. The next, a brown wave was sweeping people off their feet, smashing into buildings, crushing everything in its path. Martin Cloverty was in his home near the tank when the wave hit. The entire house was lifted off its foundation and smashed to pieces. Martin's wife and son were killed instantly. Martin survived by grabbing onto debris and riding the wave until it deposited him 2 blocks away. The firehouse at 58 Commercial Street was directly in the path. 4 firefighters were inside: George Leahy, John M. Monahan, Thomas Malloy, and Walter Merrithew. The building collapsed when the wave hit, burying them under wood, brick, and molasses. All 4 died. 10-year-old Antonio DiStasio was playing near the waterfront, collecting firewood. The wave caught him and his sister. Antonio drowned in the molasses. His sister survived but was found unconscious, covered head to toe in the sticky brown substance. The elevated railway nearly collapsed. A train had just passed over the section of track supported by the weakened girder. Moments later, the support buckles under the weight of the molasses and debris. If the train had been 30 seconds slower, dozens more would have died. As the molasses spread, it slowed down but became more dangerous. The viscosity, that thick, sticky consistency, meant people couldn't swim in it. If you fell into molasses more than a few feet deep, you couldn't pull yourself out. Your arms and legs moved in slow motion. The more you struggled, the more exhausted you became.
Rescue workers arriving on the scene found victims trapped in molasses that was waist-deep, chest-deep, sometimes over their heads. They pulled people out covered in the brown sludge, coughing and gasping, their lungs filled with the sweet, suffocating liquid. One nurse later described the scene. The sight was one of the worst I have ever witnessed. Molasses everywhere, people screaming, bodies floating in the brown mess. We couldn't tell who was injured and who was dead until we pulled them out and cleaned off the molasses. The waves spread across several city blocks, floating basements, destroying shops, and coating everything in a layer of sticky residue that would take weeks to clean. By the time the molasses stopped moving, 21 people were dead. Another 150 were injured. The North End of Boston looked like a war zone.
The Great Molasses Flood sounds absurd until you understand the physics of non-Newtonian fluids. Molasses is a non-Newtonian fluid, which means its viscosity changes depending on the forces acting on it. When you pour molasses slowly, it's thick and sluggish, but when subjected to high stress, like being forced through a rupturing tank at high speed, it behaves more like water. At the moment the tank burst, the molasses wasn't just sitting there slowly oozing out. It was under enormous pressure from the weight of 2.3 million gallons pressing down from above. When the walls failed, that pressure was released instantaneously. The result was a flood that behaved like water in terms of speed and destructive force, but with the density and viscosity of something far more dangerous. Consider the numbers. Water weighs about 8.3 pounds per gallon. Molasses weighs about 12 pounds per gallon. That means the 2.3 million gallons of molasses in the tank weighed approximately 13,000 tons, roughly the weight of 65 fully loaded Boeing 747s. When that much weight starts moving at 35 miles per hour, it carries tremendous kinetic energy. The impact force was comparable to a tsunami, but instead of water that you might swim through, this was a thick, sticky substance that trapped victims and prevented escape. The temperature also mattered. At 50 degrees Fahrenheit, molasses is significantly less viscous than at freezing temperatures. The warm spell that preceded the disaster meant the molasses was more fluid than usual, which increased the pressure on the tank walls and made the flood more destructive once the tank failed. After the initial wave, the molasses behaved differently. As it spread and slowed, its non-Newtonian properties worked against the victims. The thick consistency made rescue nearly impossible. People trapped in the molasses couldn't pull themselves free. Rescuers had difficulty wading through it. The more you moved, the more the molasses seemed to grip you. Cleanup took weeks. Workers used salt water to dissolve the molasses, but it had seeped into sewers, basements, and every crack in the pavement. For years afterward, residents claimed they could still smell molasses on hot summer days. Some said the harbor smelled sweet for decades. The physics of the disaster also explained why the tank failed so catastrophically. The pressure at the bottom of a fluid-filled tank increases with depth. For a tank 50 feet tall, the pressure at the bottom was approximately 20,000 pounds per square foot. The steel at the bottom of the tank was under constant stress, especially when the temperature rose and the molasses expanded. The poorly designed structure, with its inadequate thickness and faulty rivets, simply couldn't handle the force. Engineers who examined the wreckage found that the steel had failed in a brittle fracture. It snapped rather than bending. This indicated the metal was of poor quality or had been weakened by repeated stress cycles. The disaster became a case study in engineering failure, taught in universities as an example of what happens when profit is prioritized over safety.
The immediate aftermath was chaos. Rescue workers from across Boston converged on the North End. Sailors from the USS Nantucket, docked nearby, rushed to help pull victims from the molasses. Red Cross nurses set up aid stations. Police tried to control crowds of onlookers. The cleanup was unlike anything the city had ever attempted. You can't just mop up 2.3 million gallons of molasses. Salt water was pumped from the harbor to dissolve the substance, but it took months. Workers had to scrape molasses from buildings, streets, sidewalks. It coated everything: lampposts, storefronts, vehicles. The Boston Post reported, quote, "Molasses ankle-deep covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass showed where any life was." End quote. The 21 victims ranged in age from 10 to 78. Most died from drowning or crush injuries. Several were never found initially, Their bodies were recovered days later when the molasses was cleared. The lawsuits began almost immediately. Over 120 lawsuits were filed against the Purity Distilling Company and its parent company, United States Industrial Alcohol. The victims' families demanded compensation. Property owners wanted damages. The city wanted reimbursement for cleanup costs. The resulting trial became one of the longest and most complex in Massachusetts history. It lasted nearly 6 years and generated thousands of pages of testimony. Auditor Hugh W. Ogden was appointed to hear the case. The central question: was the tank failure an accident, or was it the result of negligence? Purity Distilling's defense was bold. They claimed the tank had been sabotaged by anarchists. This was 1919, the height of post-World War I paranoia about radical political violence. The company argued that anarchists had planted a bomb in the tank, causing the explosion. They offered no evidence for this claim. No bomb fragments were found, no witnesses reported hearing an explosion that sounded like dynamite. The theory was transparently absurd, but the company hoped it would create reasonable doubt. The plaintiffs brought in engineers who testified about the tank's design flaws. They showed that the steel was too thin, the rivets were inadequate, and the structure had never been properly tested. They demonstrated that the warm temperature on January 15th had increased the pressure inside the tank beyond what the weakened structure could handle. Most damning was the testimony of Arthur Gell himself, the Purity Distilling treasurer who had overseen the tank's construction. Under cross-examination, he admitted that no qualified engineer had designed the tank. He admitted that it had never been properly tested. He admitted that the company had known about the leaks, but had only painted the tank rather than repairing it. In 1925, Auditor Ogden delivered his ruling. The tank failure was due entirely to structural defects and poor design. There was no sabotage. The company was found liable. The Purity Distilling Company and United States Industrial Alcohol paid approximately $600,000 in settlements, nearly $10 million in today's money. It was a significant sum, but to the victims' families, no amount of money could compensate for lives lost in such a bizarre and preventable disaster. The disaster also led to changes in engineering standards. Massachusetts and other states began requiring that building plans be signed by licensed engineers. Structural testing became mandatory for large industrial tanks. The molasses flood became a cautionary tale taught in engineering schools.
The Great Molasses Flood is often remembered as a joke. Death by molasses sounds like something from a cartoon. The idea of a 25-foot wave of syrup destroying a neighborhood seems too absurd to be real. But for the 21 people who died and the 150 who are injured, it was as deadly as any industrial disaster. The physics of the flood made it as destructive as a flash flood or a chemical spill. The real lesson of the disaster isn't about molasses. It's about what happens when companies prioritize speed and profit over safety. The Purity Distilling Company knew the tank was flawed. Employees reported leaks and structural problems for years. Engineers raised concerns. Local residents complained. The company's response was to paint over the problems and hope nothing went wrong. This pattern repeats throughout history. Deepwater Horizon, Chernobyl, the Challenger disaster, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. In each case, warning signs were ignored because addressing them would be expensive or inconvenient. The molasses flood also illustrates how even seemingly harmless substances can become deadly under the right conditions. Molasses isn't toxic, it isn't flammable, it's literally a food product. But 2.3 million gallons of it moving at 35 miles per hour killed people as surely as a chemical explosion. Engineers now study the disaster as an example of structural failure under cyclic loading. The freeze-thaw cycles that Boston experiences weakened the tank over time. The sudden temperature increase on January 15th was the final stress that caused catastrophic failure. It's a reminder that infrastructure needs maintenance, testing, and proper design, not just at construction, but throughout its operational life.
For decades after the flood, Boston residents claimed they could smell molasses on hot days. Whether this was real or psychological is debated, but the idea captured something true. Some disasters leave marks that don't wash away easily. The North End rebuilt. The tank was dismantled. The site where it stood is now a recreational complex. There's a small plaque commemorating the disaster, but most people walking past have no idea what happened there. On warm January days, some Bostonians still claim they can smell the faint sweetness in the air, a ghost of the day when 2.3 million gallons of molasses turned a city neighborhood into a nightmare of sticky brown destruction. The Great Molasses Flood killed 21 people in one of the most bizarre disasters in American history. But the lesson it teaches is deadly serious. Cut corners on safety, and eventually, those corners cut back.